Hello and welcome to the 81st episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Sunday, the 10th of December, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. The podcast is back on track after an extended break, with many new shows lined up and raring to go. A quick apology to all the monthly subscribers for the non-existent output of the last few months. A quick thank you is also needed for the new subscriber, William M, and the once-off donations of Christopher C and Puya K. Many thanks indeed. This week, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Helena Sheehan to the show to discuss her most recent book, The Syriza Wave, Surging and Crashing with the Greek Left. She is a Professor Emeritus at Dublin City University and the author of many books including Marxism and the Philosophy of Science, A Critical History. So, to the interview. So, Professor Sheehan, how did you get interested in Greece in the first place?
Well, I've been interested in Greece for a long time. I started going to Greece when Yugoslavia died. I sort of felt the allure of the Balkans decades ago, going to academic conferences as well as having holidays there. And I had a holiday booked for Yugoslavia and it was cancelled by the operator. The flights were cancelled, and so I went to Greece for the first time in the early 90s. And whenever I went someplace, I always checked out the politics of it. If I were there, what would I be doing? What party maybe I would belong to? And so I decided that in Greece I would belong to a party called Syrizas, which is a precursor of Syriza. It was a party that came from the communist movement, but in a critical way. And it kind of reflected my politics as an act. I've been active on the left since the 1960s. So I became interested in Greece that way. But I wasn't evenly interested in Greece for decades. My interest would come and go. But at the beginning of the crisis, from 2008 on, I felt compelled to think about the crisis, not just here in Ireland, but in world historical terms. As a Marxist, I tend to think in world historical terms. And I felt that Greece was at the cutting edge of the crisis in terms of the suffering that was being inflicted on the Greek people through the crisis. But I also felt that Greece was at the cutting edge of a possible path beyond the crisis, because I saw the role that Syriza, the party I supported, was playing in relation to the growing social political movement in response to the crisis in Greece. So in 2012, there were two general elections, one in May and one in June. And Syriza surged in its vote in the May election to the point where it looked as if they could win the June election. And so between May and June in 2012, the whole world was watching Greece and paying attention to Syriza. So naturally, I would, since I had a longer term, affinity with Syriza for a longer time. So I felt compelled to not only pay close attention, but to go to Greece to check out my intuitions about it, to check out my perceptions of it. I wanted to see what was going on in Greece on the ground, but I also wanted to involve myself more with Syriza to see was I right about it. Because Syriza was the kind of party I always wanted to join in Ireland, because I felt that it synthesized the best of the old and the new left.
How did it differ from the old existing Communist Party, the KKE, is it?
Yes, the KKE, the Greek Communist Party. Well, they come from the Greek Communist Party. Most of the outstanding members of Syriza at that time had been in the KKE at one stage in their lives. But the KKE increasingly became very rigid and dogmatic and isolated itself more and more from the other forces of the left. So I found it impossible, to support the KKE, though I kind of still took pleasure in the support they did have. It's not a completely fossilized party. They still attract people of all ages, including young people. But I just felt very sad about their relationship to the rest of the left. And basically that's why a lot of the people in Syriza separated from left the KKE, because they had just become too rigid and too isolated from the rest of the left.
So what was it like being there on the ground at this time?
It was very exciting. I went several times a year. I still do go several times a year. I found it was the kind of party I thought it was. It was very broad. Any party that has that support is a pretty broad spectrum. And naturally, I felt more of an affinity to some people than others, because they were pretty confident that they were going to form a government at some time in the near future. There were people in it who were pretty preoccupied with just how to get there as soon as possible, rather than what they were going to do when they got there. However, I did find a substantial number of people who were doing the serious thinking about what were the possibilities of a left government in this very difficult scenario that was facing them. So I was very impressed. I was not only talking to them in their offices, but I joined them in their demonstrations. I was tear gassed with them. I had long conversations in tavernas, and it's a beautiful place. I sort of had a very nice life while I was doing it. I was constantly stimulated, and Greece is just such a seductively interesting and beautiful place.
So can you tell us then about how things developed to where they are today?
Well, it's surging and crashing. It's like a wave that crashed very dramatically. So from 2012 to 2015, they were preparing for power. There were more and more people on the streets. There were more and more people joining Syriza. There was a good relationship between Syriza and the broader social movements. The broader social movements were really, really impressive. I saw, an intensification of a lot of things that I saw for many years on the left, but in a much bigger and more interesting and more creative form than I'd seen for a long time. There were a lot of prefigurative projects, which I found really interesting. Because people were suffering so badly from the crisis. There were alternative health projects, alternative kitchens, alternative education projects. There were occupations of factories that closed down. The most dramatic and fantastic occupation I've ever seen in my whole life was in 2013. One day, I happened to be in Greece in June 2013, just having political meetings as I did. And one day, in the afternoon, the government came on air and announced the closure by midnight of their whole public broadcasting system. Like, the equivalent to, RTE or BBC was closing down at midnight. The justification being that they had a troika target to meet, of so many public sector jobs that had to be shed. And this was a way of doing it all in one go. So that was pretty shocking, as you can imagine. So they called on people to come to support the workers in ERT. So I had to figure out where it was, but, I went out with thousands of others to a place kind of like Montrose, it was, way out of the city centre. So I went to IE Parskevi, where the main television centre was. And there were thousands of people there, and it was a lovely summer evening, and they were singing, these old songs, the Greek resistance songs of Theodorakis and all that, and it was kind of stunning. But basically what ERT did was to cover its own closure, and the nature of the television changed overnight. They were basically covering their own closure, or the government demanding their own closure, except that they were saying they weren't going to close. And they had, various MPs, particularly Syriza MPs, breathing fire, including Tsipras, fire supporting the art workers. So there was, a lot of tension building up to midnight about what would happen, because people just expected the riot police would come in and forcibly close it down. But what they did instead was close down the transmitters, and they put the whole broadcasting system off air even before midnight. However, other television stations, including the Communist Party television station, broadcast out, and the European Broadcasting Union supported out, and so it was still transmitting on other transmitters and also on the internet, and so they, it was a very critical, creative form of broadcasting. It was workers' control of the means of production on a scale I had never seen as resistance before, and so they continued that for 2 years. I was there for the first 3 days. They put me on air, and it was just an amazing thing to be part of. So, but there were many, many projects like that, really active, formidable, critical, creative resistance. Those years were fantastic, and, I feel really privileged to have been part of it to the extent that I was. So, that continued. It was, protesting, resisting, being involved, the Greek left being involved in all these alternative projects. But the thing was that, all the worst measures were still being inflicted on the Greek people. So the argument was that, what was needed to set this process on a new trajectory was to elect a left government. A left government would turn all this around. It would say no to the memorandum, no to all these austerity measures. And austerity is the wrong word for these measures, by the way. It's expropriation. It's expropriation of public property. It's expropriation of people's wages and pensions. And Syriza promised in government it would put an end to this. It would reverse it. It couldn't it couldn't be capitalism one day and socialism the next. But it would, first of all, reverse the worst that was happening and build an alternative in the direction of socialism, according to a long-term trajectory.
So what happened then once Syriza came to power?
Well, they were elected in January 2015 to the elation of the majority of people in Greece, including some who never voted left. Because it offered hope. Hope was the key concept. And to the elation of the international left, and even people beyond the left. In Ireland, there was an enthusiasm for the Syriza government that went way beyond the existing left. And it just expanded people's sense of possibilities. It lifted people from their sense of powerlessness. And so the atmosphere in the first days was kind of heady, there was a huge demonstration in Syntagma Square, which was, the major site of demonstrations against the government. There was a huge demonstration for the government as they entered into negotiations with the Troika. Now and then there was just lots of publicity about ministers not traveling around in ministerial cars and coming to work on public transport or in their own cars, or in Varoufakis' case on his motorbike, and there was just a lot of colour coverage that it meant Syriza. This government captured people's imaginations. Which is a good thing for the left. However, as the negotiations began, I think it became clear that they were in over their heads, that absolutely ruthless, brutal power would be exercised against them, even beyond the economic facts of, what Syriza owed, what Syriza would cost. It was actually beyond that. I think that the Troika and basically, the system itself felt they had to cut down this project. They had to defeat this left government because of the possibilities that would arise elsewhere if it were successful. And Syriza, I think, were in over their heads with that. I felt that they had strategized for that, that they had a plan A and B and C and whatever, and would be able to cope with that, with difficulty, of course, but that isn't what happened. On the 20th of February already, they conceded far too much. Among other things, they promised no unilateral measures. But the negotiations just went on, and they adopted, the Syriza government adopted a tone that was, in turn, defiant and obsequious. And it was, but, right up to July, I still had hopes. I was there in the spring and just, I still felt there was a sense of possibility that they would manage somehow to either, negotiate some kind of truce with the Troika without signing a new memorandum. And but if the Troika refused, which was likely, that they would take the necessary measures to take control of their own economy and their own society. But that is not what happened. There was a referendum, which was a stunning experience of political mobilization. The Troika had put a deal on the table, and Tsipras, went to the country, and the Greek government went to the country to put it to the population in a referendum. It was a yes or no. Now, it wasn't a yes or no. Technically, it was a yes or no to those specific proposals, but the population took it as a yes or no to the broad approach that the Troika was taking in relation to Greece. And the opinion polls and the Greek media were massively on the yes side, or predicted that the result would be very close. And there was a lot of mobilization, both for yes and no. And even here in Dublin, we had a huge march, where people marched to the streets of Dublin shouting, "Oki, Oki," the Greek word for no, which they didn't even know a week before. People were so caught up in this, not only nationally, but internationally. So, as we know, the no side won, and it wasn't even that close. It was nearly 62% for no. And then the next day, Tsipras behaved in exactly the way he would have if the vote had been the opposite. He did exactly what he would have done if it was a yes vote. He called the party leaders of the defeated side together and, tried to come to a common negotiating position, and just negotiated. And, I think the Troika was angered at the referendum and at the result, and put on the table a deal that was increasingly worse than anything that had been put to Greece before that. So later in July, mid-July, Tsipras signed it. People in Greece, people in the Greek left were stunned, even though, it didn't happen just on that day. The path to this was well lit, but it was still stunning the day that it actually happened. And I was in Greece at that time, and most people I knew, particularly members of Syriza, were absolutely traumatized by it. Furious, just engaged in intense conversation about what to do about it, and demonstrating against their own government. On the 15th of July, I was in a demonstration outside the Parliament with members of Syriza, and my friends were both inside the Parliament and outside the Parliament when it was being debated in the Parliament. It's just unforgettable, the feeling of that. And then we were tear-gassed by the government we had supported, which was a pretty bad experience.
Do you think that Syriza were naive with respect to what the powers that be, the Troika, how they would be treated by the Troika?
Yeah, the section of Syriza that dominated the government, Tsipras and those around him, yes, I do. I think they felt they could somehow persuade them. It's kind of shocking because, they were supposedly Marxists, and, what was going on in those rooms was naked class struggle. Varoufakis was naive as well, though he tries to portray himself otherwise. But even the title of his book, Adults in the Room, quoting Christine Lagarde, if only the adults would prevail, if only, they were grown up enough to see the merit of his proposals, everything would have been all right. But that's not what it was about. That is never what it was about. It was naked class struggle. It was the global system coming down hard on a left government that was a threat to the global order if it was successful. That's what it was about. But, there's something that happens to some people when they move in these circles. And even the body language of the whole thing, I found pretty nauseating. When Tsipras went to Brussels, and there was all this, hugging and kissing with Juncker and Merkel and all that. It's inappropriate. They're there representing states, but they tended to get seduced by that. And Varoufakis as well as Tsipras.
I was very surprised by, some of the stuff that was coming from Varoufakis, who we had on the show here before he became an international global superstar, that he would try and give these people at the negotiating table like an economics lecture about why it wouldn't work. To me, You have to be very politically naive to think these people don't understand the economics of it. What they're interested in is the class interest and the power dynamic.
Yeah, well, that played well in the international media. I mean, I kind of, on one level, I like the fact that he was doing that because, it wasn't so much to convince those people, but it played well. He told a lot of, basic facts of, macroeconomic life to a global audience because those negotiations were absolutely floodlit. And he made, he's stunningly articulate. But he actually, on another level, did kind of believe that he could convince them. But it's also not true that they all understood all of that. I mean, Michael Noonan, I wouldn't say, had a very, very astute grasp of macroeconomics. But, it didn't matter whether he did or he didn't. He was going to do, whatever the EU line was, no matter what.
On some level, you would think that as well, that it would be very irritating if you're at the negotiations and you had these guys come in and preach you. It would probably put their backs up. Yeah, and I can just imagine they could say, let's, stick it to these guys who are coming in here.
Yeah, but they actually were, trying to persuade people, to come up with a better deal. I think they had to do that to a certain extent because, the starting point was that Greece was in the EU and it was in the Eurozone. So that had to be the starting point to negotiate, how can we sort things out? Can we sort things out in a way that would be equitable, to the people of Greece and begin to, reverse the worst of this within that? But they had to be well prepared for the fact that it wasn't going to be possible to do that. But I think they were right. They had to take that as the starting point because, they weren't actually elected overtly to bring Greece out of the Eurozone, let alone the EU. So I think they had to kind of, negotiate and explore the possibilities within that. But they also had to be prepared for, turning things around outside that. You see, what they had was a contradictory mandate. Basically, there was, they hadn't challenged the status quo of being within the Eurozone and within the EU. It was basically to stay in the Eurozone and to stay in the EU, but somehow to reverse the expropriation of the Greek people. So, I mean, I saw all through the negotiations, it was clear as anything that these were, proving increasingly to be contradictory mandates. But I believed that Syriza should and even would choose the former over the latter, that their strongest mandate was to reverse the expropriation. And if that meant leaving the Eurozone or even being forced out of the EU, then so be it. But it turned out that they, that they chose the one over the other.
Just getting back slightly to the technique of the negotiating, Yanis Varoufakis is going around selling books now and about how, the adults in the room. He's still basically putting forward this idea nearly that people don't understand or they're naive, when really what you say is much more apt, that it's class war. But that's not the message that's kind of being promulgated by even some of the Syriza people. It's sugarcoating the whole thing.
I read the Varoufakis book where he reviewed it in Jacobin. And, the title of my review was Closed Rooms and Class War. Sort of opposing Varoufakis' very title, Adults in the Room. And Varoufakis isn't, he's not entirely reliable narrator or analyst. I mean, I don't think he actually really understands fully at its core the difference between capitalism and socialism and really basic concepts. I mean, he understands macroeconomics at a certain macro level, but not macro at the systemic level. And also the whole book is just suffused with the whole great man theory of history, which is the Marxist I find objectionable. He distorts the story, in his absolutely amazing narcissism. But Syriza itself has its, those that have stayed in Syriza. I mean, Syriza, one of the important parts of the story is that, Syriza was exited by massive numbers of its activists, more than a third of its own central committee, its own general secretary, a number of its MPs, whole local organizations left Syriza in the summer of 2015. And people are still, even some of the people that stayed are still leaving. So the Syriza that's there now is not the Syriza that was.
Has essentially the Marxist part of it left?
Well, there's still people that call themselves Marxists in it, and some people I know still very sincerely call themselves Marxists in it, and they just can't give it up, and they find ways of justifying it. But many Marxists left, many. My hopes for Greece are in the forces of ex-Syriza, although they're not really flourishing just yet.
I have a question for you now. It's quite a cynical question. Do you think that Syriza, as in maybe the leadership, shall we say, do you think that they had any real intention of standing up when it came down to it? Do you think that this idea of saying no to the Troika was maybe somewhat of a political strategy to gain power?
Well, I think that in the case of some people in the leadership of Syriza, I would say yes, that's true. For others, I would say at some point they were sincere about that, and somehow thought they could. I can't give the same answer for all the people I'm thinking of in relation to that, even the people who have stayed in Syriza. I certainly know the people that left, honestly, believed what they were saying to the Greek people. These people built Syriza. These were, people that made their electoral victory possible. They actually did believe, they were going to say no and turn things around. So I have to give a different answer for, different sections of Syriza, and even different people within Syriza. I even think that Tsipras himself probably started out sincerely believing that he could turn it around. Some of the people around him, no, I don't think they ever really did.
I watched an interview there. It was actually on the Real News, and there was a Greek economist, a Marxist economist, who was in Syriza before the referendum.
Who?
John Milius.
Oh, yeah, I know him, yeah. You're a good guy.
He was saying that he left Syriza before they climbed down against the Troika because he knew that was actually what was going to happen, and that he thought that the referendum, essentially, they didn't want a no vote. They wanted it to be yes, so they could justify their actions and sign with the Troika all along. What do you make of that?
Well, he did see it coming. He did. In fact, even in January, before January 2015, he decided not to stand for Parliament. I mean, he was somebody who was considered a possible government minister. And even, before they started, these talks with Varoufakis, he was seen as a possible minister for finance. I mean, he was the head of the Syriza economic unit. But he kind of, over a couple of years, saw what was coming. I mean, we all saw, the same things that he saw, and that they could lead to that. But other people kind of let hope prevail and hope that it wouldn't turn out that way. But he increasingly saw that it was going that way and decided not to even stand for Parliament in 2015 and therefore not be a government minister when it happened.
What exactly did he see, when you say the writing was on the wall?
He saw the fact that they were, so preoccupied with getting into power that, they weren't paying proper attention to what they would do when they got into power. He saw the fact that they were more and more trimming. He saw, what was going on with their negotiations with Varoufakis, who was on, the right of it. Of course, he's not a member of, never been a member of Syriza, but, he was on the right of Syriza. A lot of people on the left somehow think he's more left than Syriza, but it's not so. And so, he just saw them, moving, these various signs of Tsipras and the people around him moving to the right. And he was right.
What have Syriza done in power since they signed onto the memorandum? The idea was, as far as I can make it out, that it's better to have, say, a left government like Syriza trying to do the cuts than a right-wing government. So what have they actually managed to do since they've signed that memorandum?
Yes, this was their argument. And the overall effect of Syriza in government has been to make everything worse. There have been further cuts in pensions, further cuts in wages, further cuts in public services, increasing privatization of public property. All of these things, Syriza have intensified. They've intensified them against their will, but they've nevertheless done it. And so all of those things have become worse. They do have what they call the parallel program, which are certain social welfare measures for the very, very poorest. But they're also, promoting the measures that are making more and more people plunging down into the very poorest. But they're leaving those who are poor but not defined as the very, very, very poorest to avail of these, social welfare measures, poorer. Everything is worse on the whole. And added to that is the loss of hope. In those years before they were elected, and even, the first years they were elected, there was still hope. And so, people, somehow got through these things. But now they're getting through these things in a very abject, dispirited, hopeless way. It's very sad going to Greece these days. So yes, they have this argument, and for certain people, the very poorest of the poor, there are certain things that are better than they would be under an alternative government, but it's not enough to justify the overall set of measures that Tsipras government has enacted. It's not enough to justify themselves, in my opinion, but in their opinion it is.
Me looking at these negotiations, I found it quite hard to understand what they were hoping to do. As in, they never seemed to really play their trump card in any real threatening sense. And ironically, it seemed from the outside that Varoufakis was nearly more militant than, say, the leadership of the party.
Not true.
Is that not true?
No, not true. It's like he was often the most obsequious with the Troika. Although he'd employed defiant rhetoric now and again, and he certainly does now. But that's not true, no.
Did Varoufakis have a plan for instantiating like a dual currency whereby people could use this currency to pay their taxes?
He says so. I think, at the 11th hour, he began trying to get something together that way. He makes a lot of it now in a way that I don't think is exactly accurate to what he was doing then. But yes, he and Galbraith and a few other people were working on that in the latter months.
So what exactly was their strategy? I find it quite puzzling to understand what their strategy was. It would seem to me that if you were trying to actually stand up to the Troika, you'd need to have a lot of measures similar to that or other types of measures. But it seemed like there was no willingness to let the banking system collapse. So from a left person, there's lots of very bright Marxists and people who understand power dynamics. It seems baffling to me what actually they had planned.
No, it does. I mean, and I think it was all baffling to them when they were in the middle of it, if I'm honest. I think they got in over their heads. I think they should have thought through their strategy. If they do this, we'll do that, and they never had a proper plan B in place, no matter what Varoufakis says. Towards the end, he tried to scramble something together, and Tsipras wouldn't even go for that. But there were other people, on the left of Syriza, that were doing that kind of thinking and, had a plan B worked out to some extent. Lapavitsas and had been working on that for several years already. But, Tsipras and Varoufakis barely would speak to Lapavitsas. They completely, and he's an international expert in monetary economics, and he was a Syriza MP, and, they ignored him.
So what's happened then to the body that has left Syriza? I know they started a new party, but they didn't get much of the vote.
A lot of people were just, so depressed and disoriented. They went home, as they say in Greece, and they were in disarray. The most together people immediately formed a new party called Laiki Enotita. In English, it's called Popular Unity. Not a good name. But these were people, these were the people I took most seriously. Still the people I take very seriously. They were the third largest party in Parliament when they formed a new party. Actually, they were forced. They stayed in Syriza for July and August, and they voted against the measures that Syriza was bringing to the Parliament. And Syriza got the Tsipras government got them through with the parties of the right and their votes in Parliament. So they voted against the memorandum on successive votes in Parliament. And then there were meetings of Syriza to have a party congress and to fight for who would be Syriza. And what Tsipras did, he didn't call a party congress. He barely, would consent to have a central committee meeting, and he called a general election. So those people were basically, the general election had the effect of purging the party because those people could not go and stand for election as Syriza because, they weren't supporting the series of policies and a series of votes in Parliament. So once the general election was already called, they had to hurriedly form a new party and stand in the election with, no party structure, no money, no office, nothing. And but at that time that they formed the new party, they were actually the third largest party in Parliament. So they went into the election, and, I was there during the election as well. And people were just voting either for Syriza or for the right-wing alternative, for Neo Demokratia, and they didn't want Neo Demokratia back. And a lot of people felt, oh well, Tsipras, fought as hard as he could and couldn't do anything else. And then massive numbers of people who voted for Syriza just said they will never vote again. I met many people said to me that they voted for Syriza in January, they voted Auchi in July, and they would never, ever, ever vote again. They would never trust a politician, they would never trust the political process again. So there are massive numbers of people who didn't vote. So in that way, Syriza won the election of 2015. And Aiki Notita didn't get to the 3% threshold, which was a massive disappointment to me, to them, obviously. So they're still going. They're out there in all the protests. They're, still trying to build an alternative. There are many other groups that are not quite as well organized as like Unotita, but not all of the left within Syriza have joined that. The forces of ex-Syriza haven't really been able to get themselves together. They're in disarray. But many of them are still active. They're active in the social movements. They're active in the protests against what the government's doing, but not in, a way that's really coming together just yet. But I still have my hopes that the forces of ex-Syriza will somehow find a new form. It's not going to be like Unotita. I mean, they'll have to, I think the best thing will be for them to, be part of some other larger formation eventually. But I'm watching very closely for that to happen.
I don't know if you've heard of it. There was been a big 10-episode documentary series on the Vietnam War.
I've heard about it.
It's sponsored by the Koch brothers, so you can understand that it's not going to be, too fair or too left, but it's actually reasonably good. But I was shocked when I watched it, just at the level of dedication and planning and sheer toughness of, say, the North Vietnamese communists.
Yeah.
For all the flaws of, say, that kind of Leninist, Marxist kind of stuff, Stalinist, or I'm not exactly sure so much of the politics, for all their flaws, the fortitude displayed by these people was pretty staggering when you keep watching all of that documentary series.
Yeah, I was in America during the anti-war movement, and, when I first got involved, it was, to get the US government to end the war. It was an unjust war. But increasingly, as time went on, it became more and more for the Vietnamese to win, not just for US to, stop the war. I became more and more impressed by people in the anti-war movement who were going to Vietnam and, interacting both with the North Vietnamese government and with the NLF. I became very, very impressed with the Vietnamese, and I was shocked when I first in the mid-60s went on an anti-war demonstration, and people were actually chanting ho 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 Chi Minh, the NLF are going to. But basically I came to the position, as many others like me did, that we wanted them to win, and they did, except the US won in another way.
But the level of sheer toughness and determination to win, with all the flaws of everything that happened in the communist revolutions in Europe. But when we look now to, like, say, us learning as a leftist, learning the lessons of all of that kind of stuff, and we see that in a situation where it's totally not clear that if the banks had to shut down, it would affect negatively Syriza. To me, I think it would be able to be spun in Greece that it was the EU who were the bad guys and not Syriza who were the bad guys. A simple thing like a bank strike for 2 weeks or a hit of 5% to GDP is so unbelievably unthinkable by all of these people who are historically would be interested in revolution and, socialism or communism, anarchism, whatever you want. It just seems startling to me that they were afraid even to pull the plug on just the banks just for a few weeks. When you see what happened in Argentina, it was the left that did well out of it. I'm just surprised now, looking back on it, as in, what's wrong with, radical leftists now? They can't even afford to, say, shut the economy down for a week.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't have shut the whole economy. There would be some economic life, but they should have strategized. They should have taken control earlier. They should have brought in capital controls earlier and taken control of the economy, even, at the beginning of the negotiations. I'm not an economist, so I don't want to get over my head and, saying exactly what they should have done. But I know they should have done a number of things differently than what they did do. And you're bringing it down to, their moral determination, which also is a factor. You're contrasting them with the North Vietnamese in a far more severe situation, and you're saying they come out of it badly. I think that's where you're going with that, and I have to agree.
Is it something about the kind of radical left in the West now, as well, a kind of a deeper issue that a lot of the people who are in it have a naivety about the enmity of the system when it comes down to it?
Yes, I think so. Some do. I think that. I think we have to realize what we're up against. I don't think they'd properly conceptualized, not the ones that, that made the decisions. I don't think they properly conceptualized the power that would be exerted against them. And I think we all have to, learn from that and understand it. I mean, what a formidable system it is. But we have to kind of, strategize for what we can and can't do and go as far as we can with what we can do. But it's a pretty formidable system. I mean, that will be exerted against us if we try to do anything like what they were trying to do. But we can't go out and promise to do it and not do it.
Seems to be in a tremendous psychological defeat in Greece.
Yeah, terrible defeat. It's a defeat for the whole left. And we haven't recovered from it even close yet. And yet, there have been surges of the left, elsewhere, things that hold more promise than any real power. But, the whole battle over the Labour Party in Britain, symbolised by the Corbyn election, the whole Sanders campaign, there's something from below welling up. I mean, and the Occupy movement, really brought, a lot of people into action against the whole global system. And, it might have gone away. It wasn't a sustainable form as a movement, but that ferment is still there. And people are looking for new forms. They're looking for some new way. We haven't found it yet.
What do you see then as the future for the Greek left?
I see that, they'll have to cope with defeat in the immediate future, but the forces of ex-Syriza will have to get themselves together into something coherent and take on Syriza as well as the other parties. See, I still believe in the strategy of forming Syriza-type parties. I'm still committed to Syriza-type parties. And that is broad left parties that combine the forces of the old and the old left and the new social movements. I still believe in that. And I think that, the Greek left and other lefts have to build those type of parties. That's one of the many things we have to do. I still believe in, the long march through all the institutions of the society, which is not only engaging in electoral politics, but in, gaining positions in, trade unions and universities and schools and, forming these alternative projects that meet people's immediate needs as well as, sow the seeds for a future society. I believe in all that. And the Greek left still is doing a lot of that, by the way. They're not forming an effective party yet to take on Syriza. I mean, they're trying, but they haven't succeeded in one that'll do that. But they're still involved in, all these other kind of projects. And I think that, the rest of us have to engage in all of those things all at once. But I think that forming broad left parties to form left governments is an important part of that. And the Greek left has to aim at that.
Is there a danger in being too broad in your approach?
Yes, there is. Definitely. There's a danger of being too broad. And then, having the people that are too far to the right, coming to the top and subverting the whole thing. Absolutely, it's a danger.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Sheehan, for coming on the show today.
It was my pleasure. Good to talk to you.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune, The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, by Sun Ra and his Arkestra, and you are now listening to Colin Carr playing Bach's Cello Suite No. 3 in C major. Thanks for listening, and I hope you join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega.